Have you ever noticed that disasters don't usually start out looking like a big deal? They usually start small with something insignificant, something easily overlooked. But then that goes wrong or gets out of hand, and suddenly you've got World War III on your hands. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I had the idea to loosen one pipe under our bathroom sink to clean it properly. It was gross. And this one small action caused the whole pipe assembly to fall apart. And 3 desperate drive and collect trips to Bunnings didn't fix it. And so now I'm rightly banned from all future plumbing attempts. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, we find ourselves looking at what appears to be a minor issue, a little bit of boundary pushing, a little skimming off the top, a parenting issue. But the more we investigate, the more we see it for the disaster that it is. It's a disaster that puts the future of relationship between God and his people Israel in jeopardy. That's how big a deal it is. Now, last week, the first episode of 1 Samuel finished on a high and hopeful note. Remember, Hannah was singing praises to God after he answered her tearful prayers for her son. And she was singing praises even as she handed over her son Samuel to serve the Lord for life under Eli the priest. And her song finished with words of anticipation about the good leadership of God's people. Then, right after the end of her song, we hear this. Now look with me at chapter 2, verse 12. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. So within 2 verses of Hannah's song of praise to God, we see this first sign of trouble for God's people, the first blip on the radar. And the issue is Eli's sons, Hofney and Phineas. We were introduced to Hofney and Phineas as priests of the Lord back in chapter 1, verse 3. And being priests of the Lord meant that they were part of the priestly line that God had set up through Moses and Aaron after his people came out of Egypt. This was the system that was Israel's unique privilege, because God had allowed his name to dwell in the midst of this nation and nowhere else. And God had set apart one tribe, the Levites, to take care of the worship of God within this nation. And God had set apart families within this Levite tribe to be his priests, to mediate between God and his people Israel. They represented God to the people of Israel, and the priests represented the people of Israel to God. They alone could offer sacrifices to God on behalf of the people. Being a priest of the Lord in Israel was a privileged position, an honourable position, a powerful position. And it was a position that was critical to the nation's relationship with God. So when we hear this description of Eli's sons, we're meant to be surprised and shocked. They are priests of the Lord, but they have no regard for the Lord. And the example that we're given is their behaviour when they're sacrificing. And this description of their sacrificial practice, it's probably a bit foreign to us as we heard it read. See, it involves cooking meat, but it's not exactly a standard Aussie barbecue. It's not a low and slow cook-up. The sacrificial system described here was one of the ways that Israelite families would demonstrate their trust in God. It's what we saw Elkanah's family doing as they made their annual trip to Shiloh in chapter 1 last week. We read all about how God had set it up and what he commanded about it in Leviticus, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. And believe me, the sacrificial system was not unclear. God wasn't ambiguous about this stuff. Now, within the sacrificial system, there was one type of offering that the priests would share in, that they'd get some of. And in this particular offering, 3 different parts of the animal were used in 3 different ways. The person making the offering, the sacrifice, they would remove the fat of the animal themselves. And then they'd give the fat to the priest to burn on the altar. It would never be cooked or eaten. And because Leviticus tells us that in the sacrificial system, all the fat, all the good stuff is the Lord's. Sorry if that's your favourite bit. It's the Lord's. And then the person bringing the sacrifice would also set apart the breast of the animal and the right thigh of the animal. The right thigh was given to the priest who was presenting the sacrifice, and the breast was given to the priest's family. Then the rest of the animal, everything that was left, was put in a pot and cooked by the family who brought it for sacrifice, and they'd eat it over the next couple of days. That's how this sacrifice, this fellowship offering, was meant to work. But from verse 13, we see how it's being carried out under Eli by his sons. See, over time, the priests in Shiloh, they've modified the sacrificial recipe. This is MasterChef stuff. They weren't satisfied with the parts of the sacrifice that God had given them, had set apart for them. They wanted more. And so, as part of their regular practice, the priests would get their servants to steal more from the people. The servant would come knocking on your door at mealtime, and they'd be armed with their culinary weapon of choice, a 3-pronged fork, and they'd be ready to take their extra cut of your food, your sacrifice, to feed their bosses, the priests. Now, if the priests have modified the recipe and standardized that practice, then Hofney and Phineas have thrown out the cookbook. They've turned the sacrificial system into their own personal buffet. We see that Hofney and Phineas, they're not satisfied with the God-given parts or the parts they might steal from the family. They want even more. And so they also steal the fat, the part that is set apart for God himself, the part that they're meant to be offering to God on behalf of the people. And they don't even pretend that that's a tradition. They just take what they want. They just take what they want by force if necessary. Now, this sacrifice was meant to be an expression of thanksgiving and joyful obedience to God by the faithful people of Israel. But the priests were ripping them off, ripping off the people, ripping off God, and they had twisted the whole system to benefit themselves. And God sees what they're up to, and we're left in no doubt about what God thinks. We read this in verse 17. This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, for they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. This corruption, greed, manipulation for personal gain under the cover of religion is sad. It's scandalous. And it's just as sad and scandalous now as it was then. But then alongside that manipulative, that corrupt behaviour, we also see another problem, another sinful behaviour that tragically and regularly has church leaders making the news for the wrong reasons. It's the misuse of positional power for sexual gain. And we find out that this is what they're up to in verse 22, that when women came to the tent of meeting, the priests Hofney and Phineas would sleep with them. This wasn't in the local red light district. This was at the tent of meeting, at the tabernacle, at the meeting place with God. It was at the place of worship that was meant to capture the holiness of God. But what had these priests done? They had turned it into a place that wasn't any different from any other place of worship in any of the other nations around them in Canaan. Now, at this point in 1 Samuel, with Hofni and Phineas at large, the danger is real for God's people Israel. Because at this time, dysfunction in the priesthood means the breakdown in relationship between God and Israel. The sacrificial system was the God-given way for sinful people to relate to a holy God. And the priests were God's appointed mediators of this system. They held the reins of this relationship because they represented God to the people and the people to God. And they were the teachers of God's promises, the teachers of God's commands. Now, under Eli, these privileged priestly sons have ruined their role. They've taken advantage of everyone. They've put the nation's relationship with God at risk. It's a disaster. And with Eli getting on in years, Hofney and Phineas are set to take his place. And so Israel are in deep trouble. Now, with these dreadful implications in play, we're led to look to Eli. He's the father of Hofney and Phineas. He's an old man. He's been a priest and has headed this priestly line for some time. And he's enjoyed great privilege from God in this role. Privileges that we hear about in detail from God's messenger, the man of God who speaks in verse 27. God had shown himself to Eli's ancestors. He had chosen Eli's ancestors, appointed them as his priests. He'd given them significant roles in the nation's worship. He'd given them food through the sacrificial system. Not only has Eli received these privileges, but he's also seen the work of God happen right in front of him. In verse 20, Elkanah and his wife Hannah, Samuel's parents, they'd come to see Eli when they came to make their annual sacrifices. Now remember, Hannah was barren when she first met Eli. Then she miraculously gave birth to Samuel. Then, after dropping Samuel off to Eli to serve at the tabernacle, Hannah came back the next year. And so Eli blesses her and her husband. And the next year, there's a child. So Eli blesses her again. The next year, another child. And this goes on until God has given the formerly barren Hannah another 5 children. And Eli's had front row seats to it all. He's received incredible privilege from God. He's witnessed God's incredible power. But none of this leads him to side with the Lord when it matters. In verse 29, we're told the heart of the issue for Eli, the source of his failure here. And God's messenger, the man of God, says to him, verse 29, "Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribe for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people Israel?" Did you hear it? The issue for Eli is this: his sons came before God. His sons came above God. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that Eli isn't alone in this. There's a risk that's highlighted here for those of us who are parents, because it's possible for those of us who are parents to put our kids above God, to care more about what our kids think of us than what God thinks of us, and to elevate what our kids think is important above what God thinks is important. One of the ways this can happen is when we fail to teach our kids, when we give them words but no consequences, when we respond to their disobedience with no discipline, when we aren't willing to say no to them for fear of hurting their feelings. Now, working out how to lovingly teach our kids, it's hard. I don't know anyone who finds it easy. But what we see here is that letting kids go their own way, it's not loving them. Hard lessons will come for our kids, for your kids and for mine. We can do them a favour by taking on our responsibility to teach them now, especially when it comes to the things of God. And we would be wise and loving to do it at a time when the consequences are lighter than they will be down the track. But back to Eli. Dotted throughout the book of Leviticus, we hear from God that there were meant to be serious consequences for Hofney and Phineas' behaviour. If God's commands were followed, then these guys were meant to be kicked out of the community and cut off from their people. Not because God was vindictive or unkind, but so that God's people could be protected from these guys, from their wickedness, from the punishment that might spread throughout the community. And as their father and the head of the priestly line, God expected Eli to restrain them. But in verse 23, all Eli offers his sons are words of rebuke. No further actions, no further consequences. And it even appears that Eli was happy to reap the benefits of their wickedness and sin. And so God's judgment comes not just on Eli's sons, but on Eli himself and on his whole priestly family line. God doesn't let it go. There are consequences here. This is what God says to Eli from verse 30. He says, I promised that members of your family would minister before me forever. But now, the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honour me I will honour, but those who despise me will be disdained. And then he goes on, the time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your priestly house, so that no one in it will reach old age, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, no one in your family line will ever reach old age. Every one of you that I do not cut off from serving at my altar, I will spare, only to destroy your sight and sap your strength, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hofney and Phineas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. Now, this is a fearsome prediction, a fearsome punishment from God that awaits Eli's family. But it makes the point powerfully. Eli has put someone above God, and so all his privileges will be taken away. So Eli's family used to fatten themselves on the best bits of other people's sacrifices. But now God promises that they will go hungry, begging for food. And their employment used to be secure in their priestly roles. But now they will beg for a position for any role that they can get, just to put food on the table. Now, after all this, we might still be shocked that this judgment falls on Eli as well as his sons. When we look at Hofney and Phineas, we can understand why God would judge them. But Eli, we want to sympathize with him, don't we? He did a better job than we might have done in the circumstances. He had a go. Surely he's not that bad. Surely he doesn't deserve to be punished like his sons. But God knew Eli's heart, and his heart was seen in his actions. Eli's sons mattered to him more than God did. And in some ways, Eli is even more culpable than his sons. You see, they had no regard for the Lord, but Eli knew the Lord. He knew that his sons were wrong, and still he let them do it and continue in this behavior. You see, for Eli, there was a limit to his obedience. When it came to a choice between his sons and God, his sons came out on top. And what Eli's story tells us is that this kind of compromise doesn't cut it with God. The message of the Bible is that God doesn't just want a say in our lives. No, he wants our whole life, for every part to come under his rule, under Christ's rule. And that means we don't only serve God when it's convenient, or when our priorities line up with his, or when what he wants fits with what we want. See, for some of our lives, it might be that there isn't a lot of conflict between God's agenda and mine. But the time will always come when push comes to shove and we have to choose between the two. Unlike Eli, there can't be limits to our obedience to God. Now, at this point in the story, God's justice against Eli and his family, it's only promised. We'll see it fulfilled in a couple of weeks when we look at chapter 4. But even without seeing where this ends, we would do well not to sympathize with Eli. He got what he deserved. When someone treats God with contempt like Eli did, then God's justice will catch up with them. We don't know when God's justice will fall, but we do know that it will fall. Now, this is a comfort for us as we see hypocrisy, as we see poor leadership, especially in the church, as we see the hidden sins and hidden attitudes of God's people and of the leaders of his people exposed. For many people that I've spoken to, hypocrisy is their entire experience of church, of knowing Christians. They read about the horrendous stories that come out of the Royal Commission into institutional child abuse. And they hear about money-grabbing ministers and prosperity gospel preachers. They see inconsistency between what Christians sing and say on Sundays and what they do during the week. And they call it all what it is, hypocrisy. Seeing Christians and Christian leaders behave like that puts these people off Christianity altogether. They never even get to hear about Jesus because Jesus' followers have been such a barrier to them. As we've come to grips with this disastrous picture of the leadership of God's people, well, we might wonder, well, what's next? What hope is there from this hypocrisy? And we might also be wondering, well, what's happened to Samuel? Well, someone living and working in this same space among these same people, has Samuel been sucked into the whirlwind of wickedness? Now, I don't know if you noticed as Stephen read for us, but Samuel is actually there quite a few times in this chapter. It's just a tiny bit at a time. But what we notice is that each time Samuel stands up and invites us to compare him with Eli and Eli's sons. Let me show you what I mean. In verse 11, Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli, while Eli's sons had no regard for the Lord. In verse 17, Eli's sons were treating the Lord's offering with contempt, while Samuel was ministering before the Lord, dressed up in priestly garments, looking the part, doing the part. In verse 21, Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord, while Eli's sons were sleeping with women at the tent of meeting. In verse 26, God and his people bring judgment against Hofney and Phineas, while Samuel continues to grow in stature and in favour with the Lord and with people. And interestingly, we see Jesus described with this exact same phrase that we just read in verse 26, after Jesus visits the temple when he was young. So we're meant to notice something distinctive about Samuel, about his preparation for leadership, about his priestly credentials as a faithful man, a faithful leader. Now, as we wrap up, I want to ask you, do you ever get discouraged as you look at the church, or as you read about the latest scandal involving a church leader, or as you look at the limited impact of the church in our city or our country? Or maybe as you see many people inside and outside churches who have no regard for the Lord. If these things discourage you, then you're not alone. The state of God's people, the state of the priesthood, was a disgrace during Samuel's time. It was a difficult time for God's faithful people. It would be easy to despair. The priests were notoriously corrupt. God's people were a mess. And it looked like every structure that God had put in place for the benefit of his people was ruined. It was genuinely disastrous. But as we see Samuel's faithfulness during this mess, we remember that God was at work then, even then. And that out of compassion and love for his people, he was raising up a leader. He was raising up a new high priest, one who wouldn't be like the rest. Someone who has regard for the Lord even when nobody else does. Someone who is obedient to the Lord even when nobody else is. Someone who is willing to side with God and God alone, even when it costs them everything. We see glimpses of this in Samuel. And as we look beyond Samuel to Jesus, we can continue to be confident that God is at work. That God is at work then, that God is at work now. That he is growing and building his kingdom, even through his weak-looking church, and even through its feeble leadership. And so let me lead us in prayer to our God. Merciful Lord, you alone can order our unruly wills and affections. Please teach us to love what you command and to desire what you promise, so that among the changes and chances of this world, our hearts may surely be fixed where true joys are to be found, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.